Have you ever seen a porch light that never goes out? Not because someone forgot, but because someone remembered. Each night, through rain and wind, that little bulb glows quietly in the dark, as if it's waiting or welcoming someone home who no longer arrives. There's a house at the edge of a sleepy town, a wooden porch, painted gray by time. Wind chimes whisper when the breeze drifts in from the orchard, and in the rocking chair by the door an old man sits. He doesn't speak much, but every evening, just before the stars appear, he lights the lantern, always the same way, always for the same reason. Some say he's just keeping a routine. Others believe it's something more, a promise, a memory that lives in the soft glow of a porch light and in the quiet of an autumn night. So tonight, let's walk down that path. Let's sit with him for a while and listen to what silence remembers. Now, if you're ready, we'll begin our story. At the edge of a quiet town, where the roads narrow into gravel and the streetlights end before the trees begin, there stands an old house with weathered shingles and a porch that creaks in rhythm with the wind. The paint has long faded into a soft gray, the color of ash and time, and the steps sag gently in the middle, worn smooth by years of footsteps, some recent, many remembered. It is not a remarkable house, not the kind you'd stop to take a picture of, but there is something about it, something in the way the light from the porch glows just softly enough to blur the darkness without banishing it. Something in the way the curtains move behind the windows, not from motion inside, but from the quiet breath of autumn air. Each evening, just as the sun begins to slip behind the far fields and the sky turns that particular shade of lavender blue that only comes in October, the porch light comes on, not with the flick of a switch, but with a small, deliberate turn of an old brass knob connected to an even older oil lamp mounted in a metal sconce above the doorway. And the man who lights it, his name is Eli. Eli does not rush. He has lived too long to believe in hurrying. His days move slowly, like the shadows across his living room wall, stretching and shrinking with the light, never asking for attention. He wakes with the birds, eats when the kettle boils, and walks to the edge of his yard every morning just to see what the wind has brought. Some days it brings nothing. Other days it carries the scent of apples ripening on distant trees, or the faintest hint of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Eli listens to the wind as though it's telling a story, and maybe, in a way, it is. The house he lives in was built by his grandfather, the porch added later by his father, the rocking chair by the door, that was a gift from her. Her name was Miriam. He still says her name out loud sometimes, not often, just enough to keep it from fading. They lived here together for 46 years, not all of them easy, but every one of them full. And now, though she's been gone for nearly a decade, Eli keeps the porch light burning. He says it helps him see the stars better, but anyone who knows him knows it's more than that. On this particular evening, the wind is gentler than most. It glides through the orchard at the back of Eli's property, rustling the tall grass and nudging the last of the maple leaves from their branches. They fall without resistance, spinning softly like tiny amber dancers, each one taking its turn before resting among the others. Eli stands by the screen door, hand on the knob, listening, not for anything in particular, just listening. The screen squeaks faintly as he steps out. He walks with the careful steadiness of someone who knows the porch by heart. Each board knows him, and he knows each board. He steps around the one that wobbles, pauses at the third step as he always does. The light above the Duggar waits patiently. He reaches up, slowly, mindfully, and turns the knob of the oil lamp. There's a soft click, and then the warm amber glow spills gently down the siding and onto the porch floor. The light is not bright. It does not startle the shadows or banish them completely. It simply joins them, softens them, holds them close. Eli lowers his hand, lets out a quiet breath, and settles into the rocking chair with a faint creak. The chair rocks once, then again, then falls into a rhythm as old as the house. Somewhere far off, an owl calls. Closer by, the wind stirs the chimes, just barely, and in the stillness, Eli remembers. He does not chase the memories. He never has. He lets them come as they please, like visitors he never wants to pressure. Tonight, they come gently. He remembers a sweater, wool, hand-knit with a button missing. Miriam had made it for him one November when the air turned early. It was too long in the arms and too short in the waist, but he wore it anyway, and she'd laugh each time he put it on, calling him her lopsided scarecrow. He remembers the way she used to place her teacup on the porch railing, always in the same spot, leaving behind a faint circle only he could see now. He remembers how she'd hum when she rocked, not a tune he could name, but one that seemed to follow the wind. Eli lets the chair rock in time with that memory. The light flickers slightly, then steadies. There's comfort in repetition, in small rituals, in lighting a lamp that no longer needs to be lit, because it still means something. Inside the house, the kitchen clock ticks softly. The kettle, which he set earlier, begins to hiss, but he does not rise just yet. He's not done sitting. The porch smells like old cedar and late-season apples. There's a cushion under him, worn thin in the middle but soft enough. His hands rest on the arms of the chair, fingers curled inward, not from pain but from peace. Eli closes his eyes, not to sleep, just to rest them. The wind moves again, brushing against his cheek like the back of someone's hand, and somewhere in the quiet, he hears the unmistakable sound of a memory arriving. It doesn't knock, it just steps up the porch and settles in beside him. The next morning came in soft. There were no alarms, no sudden light, just a slow unveiling, like someone lifting the edge of a blanket, careful not to wake the one sleeping beneath it. The fog sat low across the fields behind Eli's home, folding into the grass like breath held close. It was the kind of morning that made silence feel generous, like a companion who never needed to speak. Eli stirred just after 6, the same as always, not because he had anywhere to be, but because his body knew the rhythm of the day better than any clock. He sat up in bed slowly, legs swinging down to the cool wooden floor. His slippers waited just where he'd left them the night before, lined up neatly under the chair, toes pointing east toward the rising light. The kitchen was still shadowed when he stepped in. He didn't turn on the overhead bulb. He never did that before 7. Instead, he reached for the small oil lamp by the sink and lit it with a practiced hand. The match hissed and flared, and the flame caught easily, blooming into a warm glow that settled across the countertops and curled into the corners. There was something kinder about lamplight, he thought, something slower, something more willing to sit with you while the world stirred itself awake. He filled the kettle from the tap and set it on the stove. The metal clicked as it settled into place, and he adjusted the flame just enough so the hiss of the gas was barely audible. As the kettle warmed, Eli moved to the small table by the window, the one with the slightly uneven leg where he always placed a folded napkin to keep it steady. On the table sat a wooden box, worn smooth at the edges. It had no lock, no label, only the kind of weight that comes from being opened too many times to count. Eli opened it again that morning, the way he did every few weeks. Inside, there were letters, all written by hand, all addressed to Miriam. Some were short, no more than a page or two. Others spilled across folded papers, words written in careful script. None had stamps, none had ever been mailed, and none of them were meant to be. He picked up the one on top, dated 3 months back. The ink had faded slightly, and the corner was smudged where he'd rested his thumb too long. He read it again, even though he already knew the words. They were mostly about the orchard, how the apples had come in early that year, how the crows had been bolder than usual, how he'd found one of her old baskets behind the shed and tried to fix the handle but hadn't quite gotten it right. The kettle whistled just then, soft and steady. Eli smiled faintly, folded the letter back and slipped it beneath the others. Then he made tea, chamomile with a little honey. He drank it on the porch, wrapped in a cardigan older than the cushion beneath him. The light outside was shifting, fog lifting inch by inch as the sun made its way up. It would be a slow day. He could feel it already. No visitors, no errands, just a steady rhythm of things unfolding, the way they always had. The trees in the yard were turning now, leaves going from green to gold, then to russet and brown, like old photographs fading at the edges. Eli watched one leaf tumble down from the maple near the fence, caught in a spiral before settling among the others that lined the grass like scattered pages. He thought of Miriam again, not in a sharp way, just the kind of thinking that comes when something outside lines up perfectly with something inside. She had loved mornings like this, especially when it was quiet. She would sit just where he sat now, her legs tucked beneath her, hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and she'd say, with that half smile of hers, "The world is still deciding what kind of day it wants to be." He always liked that. The hours passed without notice, the porch light, still off from the night before, waited patiently for its evening shift. Eli spent the better part of the morning sweeping leaves from the steps, not to keep the porch clean exactly, but to keep a promise to himself that the place would always be ready for someone or something. By noon, the sun had found its place high in the sky, and the shadows retreated beneath the trees. Eli retreated too, back into the house where it was cooler, the curtains drawn just enough to keep the light from being too bold. He sat in the armchair by the bookshelf, next to the table where a candle sat half-burned. It had been a gift. He couldn't remember who had brought it, but it smelled like vanilla and something green, maybe sage. He didn't light it, not yet. He'd wait until dusk. Instead, he reached for a book, a collection of poetry he and Miriam used to read together. The spine had long since cracked, and the pages had gone soft from years of turning. He opened it somewhere in the middle, not bothering with bookmarks. The poem on that page was about silence, not the silence of absence, but the silence that follows peace. He read it aloud, his voice low and even, the syllables soft like the folds of an old quilt. When he finished, he closed the book and rested it on his lap. And then he sat, not doing anything, just being. The house was still, the kind of still that comes when everything is exactly where it should be. Outside, a breeze rustled the trees. Inside, the shadows stretched slowly across the floor, reaching like long arms toward the past. Later, as afternoon faded, Eli moved once again to the porch. He brought the candle this time, set it gently on the table beside the rocking chair, lit it with the same matchbox he'd used for years, watched as the flame flickered, steadied, and began its quiet work of holding back the night. The porch light would come next, but not yet. He wanted to sit a while first, watch the candle, let the light settle into the grooves of the wood, let it remind him that softness was still possible, even at the edge of things. Closed his eyes, listened to the hush of dusk gathering in the trees, and breathed in deep as if the air itself remembered something worth keeping. And maybe it did. Maybe the wind slipping through the branches was carrying not just leaves, but stories, ones too gentle to be heard during the busy hours, ones that waited for quiet to find their voice. Evening came not as a sudden thing, but as a quiet conversation between the light and the trees. It began at the edge of the orchard, where the shadows first thickened, curling around the bases of the trunks like cats returning home for the night. Then it spread, softly, respectfully, across the lawn, across the porch steps, and finally into the folds of Eli's cardigan. He felt it before he saw it, that slight dip in temperature, the way the light on the porch candle changed hue, from golden to amber to something closer to memory. Eli reached for the small brass knob mounted on the wall beside the front door. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging the significance of the gesture. The lamp responded with its usual soft hum and flare. A warm glow spilled outward, meeting the candlelight as if two old friends had found each other again. There was a comfort in that small meeting of light, not bright, not dazzling, just enough. He eased back into the rocker, its wood familiar beneath him. The chair gave a faint groan as it accepted his weight, and then the rhythm began, a gentle forward and backward sway, like the tide brushing the shore on a windless night. His teacup sat untouched on the table. It was her cup, actually, delicate bone china with a tiny chip along the rim, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. The floral pattern had faded, but the handle still curled like a ribbon. He had made it a habit to use her cup on Sundays, but lately he'd found himself using it more often, not out of sadness, just out of closeness. There was something about the feel of that cup in his hand that anchored him. It was lighter than the others, and somehow that mattered, as if it still carried her fingerprints, hidden deep in the glaze, waiting to be felt again. The candle flickered in response to a gust of wind, just enough to nudge a few leaves across the porch. They scraped lightly across the floorboards, a sound like paper rustling or someone turning a page. Eli smiled. That's how she used to read, not fast, not with urgency, but slowly, savoring each word, each line, like it was a friend she hadn't seen in a while. He remembered how she would pause after a sentence and just look up, not at anything in particular, just into the distance, as if she were giving the story room to settle before moving on. It made him want to reread those books now, not for the stories, but for the echoes between the lines, for the memories that clung to margins and dog-eared pages. The sky turned deeper as he rocked, a shade somewhere between violet and soot. The stars began to show themselves one by one, not rushing, but revealing. He could name a few of them still. Miriam used to know more. She'd point them out with the same certainty she had when tying her apron or pruning the roses. "I don't care what anyone says," she once told him. "Orion's belt is crooked, and I love that about him." He chuckled at the memory, a quiet sound that drifted off the porch and into the trees. The wind caught it, maybe carried it somewhere. Maybe that's what wind is for. carrying the things we're not ready to let go of but can't hold on to alone. The candle was burning lower now. He watched the way the wax curled and pooled, the tiny movements of the flame like it was breathing, inhale and exhale, inhale and exhale. It made him think of the old church, the way the sanctuary would smell just before Christmas, pine boughs and candle smoke and something sweet that lingered on people's coats. They had always gone to the late service, less crowded, quieter. Afterwards, they'd walk home, coats buttoned, fingers entwined in mittens, and she'd always say the same thing: "Let's not rush. It's too pretty out." He missed that most of all. Not the holiday, not the carols, but the way she paused in the moment, held it up like a snowflake to the light. Eli shifted in his chair and picked up the teacup. It had gone cold. He didn't mind. He held it anyway, both hands wrapped around the porcelain like it still held something warm. He didn't drink, just held and listened to the night, to the candle, to the spaces between. The trees rustled again, a language he would never fully understand but liked to hear just the same. The porch lamp hummed softly, like it too had settled into thought. Somewhere in the field, a fox barked, brief and sharp. Then silence returned, deeper than before. Inside the house, a single light glowed from the hallway. He'd left it on intentionally, not because he was afraid of the dark, but because light in small doses can be a kind of memory too, a way of saying this place is still lived in, still loved. The clock chimed 8 times from the mantel, not loud, just enough to remind him where the hour had gone. Eli set the teacup back on the table, right where it had been. He would wash it in the morning, or maybe not. Maybe it would stay just as it was, waiting patiently, like the porch light, like the candle, like him. The next day began with rain, not a storm, not the kind that lashes against windows or soaks the earth in violence, but a rain that simply existed, a quiet, steady presence, falling gently from a sky the color of worn denim, touching everything without asking for attention. Eli stood by the kitchen window, tea in hand, watching the drops collect along the edge of the glass. They pooled in slow rivulets, trailing downward like thoughts that had yet to settle. Beyond the porch, the grass shimmered under the gray light, and the trees swayed with a kind of reverence, bowing to a rhythm older than clocks. The porch light was still off. He never turned it on during the day, but its presence was still felt, even unlit, like a pause in a familiar sentence. After breakfast, 2 slices of toast and half a pear, Eli made his way to the back room. It was a small space, more a wide hallway than a room, with low shelves along one wall and a wide oak cabinet along the other. Miriam used to call it the weather room because it always smelled like the outdoors, pine needles in the fall, lilacs in the spring, the soft musk of summer dust. The floor creaked differently here, lower and slower, as if the boards knew this space held more memory than motion. Eli opened the cabinet with both hands, its doors groaned slightly, their hinges older than some of the trees in the orchard. Inside were drawers, 9 of them, each labeled in her handwriting: spring, early summer, high summer, harvest, October, first frost, snow, deep winter, and return. He stood for a moment before choosing one. October. His fingers brushed the small brass pull, and the drawer slid open like a sigh. Inside, there were bundles of dried herbs, lavender, thyme, and a small bundle of sage tied with red thread. There was a pressed maple leaf, its color still clinging to the fibers of its veins, and beneath it all, folded carefully in wax paper, was a note. The paper crackled as he unfolded it. Her handwriting was still strong, though the ink had softened with time. If it's raining when you read this, boil the lavender for 7 minutes. Open the kitchen window. Let the scent stay a while. Then sit with it. You don't have to do anything else. That's enough. Eli smiled, and for a moment he forgot the ache in his knees. He brought the lavender to the stove and filled a small pot with water. The steam rose slowly as it heated, carrying the scent across the room. Not overwhelming, just present, like her. He opened the window even though the rain still whispered down. The screen filtered it, letting in the sound without the chill. It mingled with the scent of lavender until the two became indistinguishable, like two old friends catching up in the quiet. Eli sat at the table with the blanket across his lap and let the warmth settle around him. He remembered another October. They had gone apple picking that year, nothing unusual in that, but it was the way the light had fallen that day and how she'd laughed when a yellow jacket chased him halfway down the orchard path. He could still hear her, that laugh, clear, unself-conscious, full. They had brought home too many apples. She made pies. He carved one into a face and left it on the porch with a candle inside, and when the wind knocked it over, they both watched through the window as the flame guttered out in the dark. "That's all right," she'd said, pulling her shawl closer. "Some lights aren't meant to last, but the memory of them, well, that stays longer than the flame ever could." Back in the present, Eli stood and turned off the stove. The pot of lavender water had reduced to a warm, fragrant syrup. He didn't drink it, didn't need to. Its purpose had already been fulfilled. He left the window open a little while longer and stepped onto the porch. The rain had softened, not quite stopped, but it was gentler now, the way it tapped against the railings like a familiar hand on a familiar shoulder. He sat. The cushion beneath him was still warm from earlier. The rocking chair moved just slightly as if greeting him. The porch light remained off, but the candle, still in its glass cup from the night before, had collected a pool of water at its center. Eli tipped it gently, letting the water spill over the edge and onto the wooden floorboards, where it disappeared like a secret returning to the earth. He reached into his cardigan pocket and pulled out a slip of folded paper, blank. He'd been carrying it around for a few days, unsure what to write. Today it felt right. With slow care, he leaned forward, using the armrest as a desk, and began to write in the soft light of the cloudy day. "Dear Miriam, it rained this morning. The kind of rain you used to call thinking rain. Not too heavy, not too light. I made the lavender tea like you wrote in your note, but I didn't drink it. I just let it stay a while. I remembered the orchard again, the day of the yellow jacket and the too many apples. You'd laugh if you saw what's become of the tree closest to the fence. It's leaning now, the way you said it would. The candle filled with rain today. I poured it out. It felt like a small ritual. You always said rituals mattered. I think you were right. Love, always." He folded the letter and tucked it gently into the inside pocket of his cardigan. Not the drawer, not the box, just close. The wind shifted, coming in from the west. That had always been her favorite direction. She said it smelled of distance and change. Eli closed his eyes and let it touch his face. Let it carry whatever it had come to bring. Somewhere, a bird called out, sharp and sudden, and then the quiet returned, as full and generous as it had been all morning. He did not light the porch lamp just yet. There would be time. For now, he simply sat beneath the soft sky, beside the cup with the chipped rim, holding a letter he would never mail, in a house where rain and memory met, and nothing hurried to become anything else. The morning after the rain was filled with light, not the fierce sun-bright light of summer, but the soft, filtered kind that slips through leaf-laced windows and lands like a blessing on old wood and waiting hands. Eli woke to it, not startled but aware, as if the house itself had nudged him gently, reminding him that another quiet day was waiting to be lived. He sat at the edge of the bed, feet brushing the worn rug, and watched the way the sunlight played across the wall, making long golden slashes across the bookshelf, dust rising in slow motion with each breath he took. There was no sound but the creak of the floorboards, the sigh of the kettle warming on the stove, and the gentle murmur of birds beyond the windows. Finches, he thought, or maybe wrens. Miriam would have known. She had always known their calls, had names for them even when they didn't belong to a species. That one, she once said, nodding toward a particularly high chirp. That one's called Needle. Listen to how it pierces the morning. And he had listened. He still did. Even now, years after her voice had quieted, he heard it in the way the world stirred. That morning he skipped the toast, made tea with lemon instead, and added a spoonful of honey from the old glass jar they kept in the cupboard, the one with the label half peeled but still faintly readable. Franklin Hill Apiary, raw wildflower honey. The label had been Miriam's doing. She had insisted on buying from the local beekeeper, saying it tasted better because the bees knew the land. Everything we take in should know where it came from, she'd said once, drizzling golden syrup over a biscuit. Eli had smiled at that then. He smiled again now. With his tea in hand, he made his way into the front room. Not the porch, not yet, but the small sitting room just beyond it, where a shelf ran along the top of the east-facing window. The shelf had always been hers, her space for the things she called keepers, little objects too small to matter and too precious to forget. There was a tiny glass owl, no bigger than a thimble, a pine cone dipped in silver paint from a long ago Christmas, a button from her mother's coat, and a folded paper star that had once hung above their bed during a power outage. Eli hadn't touched the shelf since she passed, not out of grief, but out of reverence. It had stayed there all these years, dust settling slowly on memories made tangible. He dusted around it, but never through it. That morning, though, with the light pouring in and the tea warm in his hands, he reached up, not to rearrange, not to clean, just to hold. He picked up the owl, felt the cool curve of its back, the smoothness of the glass that had somehow never cracked, even through moves and storms and years. He set it down again, in the exact same place, and then touched the pine cone. Its scent had faded long ago, but somehow he still remembered it. He didn't cry. There was no sadness in this moment, only a kind of fullness, the kind that comes from remembering and being remembered. As he stood there, the light shifted slightly, casting a soft glow over the shelf. It was almost as if the morning had paused to notice too. Eli stepped back, took another sip of tea, and let the warmth settle inside him. Later, he sat on the porch again. The cushion had dried from yesterday's rain, and the air carried that sweet, fleeting scent of leaves beginning to let go. It was the kind of day that asked nothing of him, no calls to make, no errands to run, just a steady presence, the house, the trees, the wind threading its way through the eaves. He watched a squirrel dart across the fence, watched a single yellow leaf fall from the elm and land beside his boot, watched the shadows move in long, slow strides across the porch floor. The world was not in a hurry, and neither was he. He lit the candle again, not out of need, but out of habit. The small flame danced in the breeze but held, and beside it the lamp waited, unlit but ready. Eli looked out toward the edge of the yard, where the path curved behind the barn and disappeared into trees. The same path Miriam had walked every evening after supper, sometimes with clippers in hand to gather herbs, sometimes with nothing but her thoughts and the company of the fading day. He could almost see her, not as a ghost, but as a memory with weight, a presence felt, not seen. She'd be wearing her cardigan with the missing button, her garden shoes just a little muddy, and she'd wave without looking back as if to say, "I'll be back soon, don't wait up." He had always waited, he still did. As the sun began to lower, casting long gold across the porch rail, Eli did something he hadn't done in years. He whistled, just a soft two-note sound, a call they used to use when one of them was out of sight, a way of saying, "Where are you?" and "I'm here." The sound drifted across the yard, disappeared into the trees, returned in silence. Still, he smiled. Sometimes a silence is its own kind of answer. The porch light clicked on just as the sky turned lavender. The flame in the candle bent low, then righted itself. The stars began to arrive, one by one, with no fanfare, no noise, just presence. Eli leaned back in his chair, hands folded, heart steady. Another day had passed, not full of news, not marked by achievement, but full nonetheless of light and quiet and all the small things that stay. The next morning unfolded like old linen, unwrinkled not by hands but by the slow, steady exhale of a house waking with the sun. Eli rose earlier than usual, not from restlessness, but because the air had changed. He could feel it even in his bones. A shift too subtle for calendars, but clear enough to those who had lived with the land long enough to listen. It was the beginning of the turning, not quite frost, not yet. But the light had cooled, the shadows arrived with sharper edges, and the smell, earthy, crisp, edged in something that reminded him of dry leaves and distant chimney smoke, told him that October was beginning to give way. He reached for his sweater, the thick one with elbows patched and collar softened by time, and pulled it over his shoulders as he moved into the kitchen. The light in the room was gentle, filtered through lace curtains Miriam had sewn by hand, long before lace became something only found in antique shops or memory. He stood for a moment at the counter, hands resting flat on the cool surface of the worn maple top. The grain of the wood still held faint lines from her baking days, circular traces where she kneaded dough with quiet confidence. Today felt like a day for bread, not out of hunger, but out of rhythm. The bread drawer was in the far cabinet, low to the floor, with a simple wooden pull and no metal parts. Miriam had insisted on it. Bread should be kept near the ground, she'd said once, cool, quiet, close to the roots. Eli opened it slowly. Inside was the old linen sack she had used to line the space. Faint traces of flour still clung to the fabric, and tucked beneath it, folded with the care of someone who believed in the ritual of repetition, was her recipe card. He didn't need to read it. He knew the steps by heart, but he unfolded it anyway, held it in the morning light, let the shape of her letters stir something warm in his chest. He read aloud softly. 2 cups, warm water, 1 tablespoon, honey, 1 packet dry yeast, 4 cups flour, maybe 5 if it's a cold day, salt, just a pinch more than you think. Be patient, let it rise twice, don't rush good bread. He smiled. She always wrote notes to herself in parentheses. He moved slowly, without hurry, measured by feel, poured water, warmed honey, stirred gently. The kitchen was quiet, save for the occasional creak from the walls as the sun hit them fully. Even the birds outside seemed to keep their voices low, as though respecting something sacred. The yeast bloomed as expected, the dough came together with a satisfying weight, and soon Eli's hands were dusted with flour, his palms pressing gently into memory. The movement slow, steady, familiar. He placed the dough in a wide ceramic bowl, the one with the crack near the rim that had never leaked. He covered it with the striped towel she had loved. Then he waited. While it rose, he stepped outside. The porch was already touched by light, angled low through the trees. It painted the floorboards gold, cast long shadows that shifted with the wind. He sat. No candle today, no tea yet, just the scent of yeast in the air and the gentle, quiet pulse of a morning that asked for nothing but presence. A pair of crows called out from the far end of the orchard. Eli watched as they flapped lazily from one fence post to the next, then disappeared into the maples. Their calls were not mournful nor joyful, just crows, doing what they've always done. He leaned back, listened. The wind picked up just slightly, and with it came the scent of damp leaves and warm pine. Somewhere, a door closed, perhaps a neighbor's barn. The sound echoed faintly across the fields, then faded. Back in the kitchen, the dough had doubled, as it always did. He pressed it down gently, his fingers leaving soft dimples in the surface. Then he shaped it. No mold, no perfection, just the way Miriam had always done. A bit long, a bit uneven, like every loaf that came before it. The oven clicked to life, filling the space with its familiar hum. He placed the loaf inside with care, then set the timer, though he didn't need it. He knew the smell would tell him. While the bread baked, he wandered into the front room, not to do anything, just to pass time the way bread does. By rising slowly in warmth, he opened the small chest near the window seat. Inside were yarns in various stages of use, some tangled, some wound neatly, some still carrying her scent in the fibers. He ran his fingers across them, not pulling, not untangling, just touching. He remembered the nights they'd spent here together, her knitting, him reading aloud, not entire books, just lines, just voices filling the air between them. The smell reached him before the timer did. He returned to the kitchen, opened the oven door, and stood in the steam of it for a moment. The crust was golden, cracked just slightly, exactly right. He turned off the oven, let it sit, and made tea. Later on the porch, he sat with a slice of warm bread, no butter, no jam, just bread, plain, quiet, enough, a small plate, a cup of tea, and the company of a day that had asked nothing of him but presence. He looked out across the yard, watched the leaves fall, one by one, never all at once, and thought how even the trees seemed to understand that letting go should be done with care. The porch light remained off, the candle unlit, but there was still light here, in the steam rising from the cup, in the scent of bread baked with memory, in the soft rhythm of his breath as it met the calm of late morning, and that too was enough. The afternoon light stretched across the floorboards like a cat, long, warm, and unbothered. It slipped in through the porch windows, quietly laying itself down over the armrests of chairs, over the old rug with its faded corners, and across Eli's lap, where a small tin box now rested unopened. He had found it in the back of the linen cabinet, tucked behind a stack of folded tablecloths. He hadn't been looking for it, wasn't even thinking about it, but the moment his hand brushed the edge of it, his breath had slowed. The tin was green, once brighter, now worn at the edges, with the faintest ghost of lettering across the top. Red Oak Dry Goods, Notions, Needles and Thread, Miriam's button tin. He remembered it as a quiet soundtrack to their evenings, the gentle tap of buttons being poured into her palm, the clink of them against the wooden table, the way she sorted them not by color, but by feel. "There's smooth buttons and story buttons," she'd said once, holding up a thick wooden one, rubbed dull from age. "This one belonged to your father's coat. I can feel it in the weight." Eli smiled now as he lifted the lid. Inside, nothing had changed. The buttons lay like small coins in a forgotten currency. Mother of pearl, plastic, brass, fabric-covered ones, and a few that weren't buttons at all, but had earned their place in the tin just the same. A small marble, a safety pin bent with time, a faded ticket stub folded in two. He ran his fingers through them, not searching, just remembering. Each button seemed to carry a season. The blue one with the cracked edge had been on her gardening smock. The one she wore through 3 summers, until the hem frayed and she turned it into a bag for onions. There was a set of 4 white ones, from the cardigan she wore every Christmas, the one that smelled faintly of cinnamon and fir. She used to leave the top button undone, said it made her feel less like company, more like home. And then tucked along the edge was the red one, bright once, now dulled to the shade of an apple left too long on the windowsill. That one had come from her winter coat, the coat she wore the day they drove out to see the snow geese, the day the sky had opened in a hush of white, and she'd held his hand the whole walk back to the truck, as if she were holding more than just his fingers. He closed the lid gently, not from sadness, from fullness. The light had begun to shift again, late afternoon curling into its last hour, and the porch humming with the familiar ache of day preparing to fold itself into dusk. Eli stood, the tin still in hand, and walked toward the small wooden shelf above the coat rack. There, beside a dusty jar of dried sweet peas and an old ball of string, he placed the button tin, not hidden, not displayed, just placed, where it could rest and be remembered without having to be seen. He stepped back out onto the porch. The cushion on the rocking chair held the warmth of the day, and when he sat, the chair moved as though it had been waiting for him to return. In the distance, the orchard was quiet. The trees stood in soft stillness, their branches heavy with the scent of fall. No wind stirred, but a few leaves fell anyway, as if they'd decided on their own that the moment had come. Eli watched them drift, their paths slow, spiraling, not unlike memory itself, circular, never in a straight line, always moving through the air as if seeking a gentle place to land. He sipped tea from a mug this time, a plain, sturdy one, not hers, not today. Today felt like his turn to hold the weight of things, to sit without her cup beside his and know that it was still enough. He leaned back, listening. The porch board sighed softly. The kettle inside clicked as it cooled. A cricket somewhere beneath the steps began its evening song. Time moved in small shapes. As the sun kissed the tops of the trees, he reached for the small blanket draped over the arm of the chair. It smelled faintly of cedar and wool. He pulled it across his lap. A neighbor's dog barked in the far distance. Children's laughter flickered like candlelight from across the field, then disappeared altogether. Eli didn't mind the quiet. He never had. There was a kind of honesty in it. No need to speak, no need to fill the air with more than it asked for. He closed his eyes, let his fingers rest along the arm of the chair, his other hand holding the warm curve of the mug. He thought of the buttons again, of how each one had outlived its use and yet remained, and how, somehow, that made them matter even more. The light faded gently, no suddenness, no rush, just a slow bowing of the day. He did not light the porch lamp right away. Instead, he let the dusk settle, let it find its place on the steps, in the folds of his sweater, between the fence slats. It was a kind dusk, the sort that came not to end things, but to hold them softly in its arms until they slept. And Eli, wrapped in the hush of it all, felt no need to move. Not just yet. The following morning arrived gently, with the kind of hush that belongs only to late autumn. The wind had shifted in the night, and now carried a crisper voice. Not cold, but preparing. The maple trees behind the house stood quieter than usual. Their leaves had thinned during the week, and now, with each passing day, they dropped their golden coins more willingly. Eli stirred as a light came in, not bright, just soft and pewter-colored, spilling across the quilt in his bedroom like a slow-moving stream. He didn't sit up right away. Instead, he lay there a while, hands resting on his chest, eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the ceiling plaster, as though waiting for the day to open its eyes before he did. Eventually he rose, stepping into his slippers with the easy muscle memory of decades. He dressed slowly, choosing his clothes like one would choose words, carefully with space between them. A flannel shirt still holding the faint scent of line-dried air, woolen socks, the cardigan with the small tear in the sleeve. He noticed it as he reached for the teapot. The unraveling edge of the cuff, thread pulled loose, likely caught on the splintered arm of the porch rocker. He didn't sigh, didn't mutter, just noticed. And after breakfast, just toast today with the last bit of pear jam, he made his way to the back of the house where Miriam's sewing basket still sat beneath the window. It had been years since he'd opened it, not out of neglect, but reverence. The lid creaked faintly as he lifted it, the hinges slightly rusted with time and dust. Inside, everything remained just as she'd left it, spools of thread in muted colors, moss green, dusty rose, oat, cream, a small velvet pincushion shaped like a tomato, its surface dotted with pins stuck in like stars, a pair of sewing scissors still sharp, a thimble thin along one side from years of use. He ran his fingers over them gently, as one might brush the surface of a still pond, each item a quiet sentence in a language only memory could read. He chose the oat-colored thread, not an exact match, but close enough. He threaded the needle slowly, holding it up against the light from the window, his fingers moving with practiced care despite their stiffness. He sat down near the fireplace, the morning light catching on the edge of the basket, and began to mend. Each stitch was small, neat, unrushed. He didn't work to finish, he worked to be present. The sound of the thread pulling through wool was barely audible, but in that still room, it was enough to bring back the memory of Miriam sewing at that very spot. Legs curled beneath her, head bowed, lips moving in time with her breath. She always hummed while she sewed, not tunes with names, just lines of sound that floated from her like wisps of wind through an open window. He remembered one afternoon, many years ago, when she sat mending a quilt while he shelled beans. They had said no words for nearly an hour, but the silence had been rich, not empty, but full of everything that didn't need to be spoken. He finished the last stitch, tied it off with a simple knot, ran his thumb over the patch. It held. That was enough. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly. The trees whispered as they bent, leaves lifting into the air, like birds finding their moment. Eli stepped out onto the porch. The chair greeted him with a familiar sigh. He sat slowly, wrapped the mended cardigan tighter across his chest, and watched the morning unfold in slow shapes. The yard had begun to change. The once vibrant flowers along the edge of the fence had gone to seed. The asters had faded, the marigolds hung their heads. But there was a different kind of beauty in it now, a quiet settling, a kind of letting go that didn't feel like loss, but permission. The porch rail was covered in leaves again. He didn't sweep them this time. Let them gather. Let them soften the sound of footsteps. Let them become part of the rhythm of the day. He closed his eyes. The wind touched his cheek like a memory, and in that touch, he thought of how many things in life were mended quietly, with no need for witnesses, just thread and time and a kind hand. Later, when the sun had climbed higher, he stepped down from the porch and made his way to the shed. It stood just past the apple tree, its roof sagging slightly on one side, but still solid, still home to the rakes and spades and half-emptied seed packets from springs long gone. He opened the door slowly. It stuck a little, as always. The scent of earth and old wood met him at the threshold. Inside, in a box marked twine, he found what he was looking for. An old ball of cotton string, slightly tangled, soft from age. He took it with him, not for any grand project, just to have, just to carry something simple back into the house. A thread, perhaps, to tie something together later, or maybe just to hold, to remind him that some things, even when unused, still carry purpose. That night, as the sun fell below the ridge, he lit the porch lamp again. It glowed with its usual hum, not bright, not bold, but steady. He set the ball of string on the table beside the candle. It looked almost like a soft white stone in the dim light. The stars began to show. The wind settled. The night unfolded slowly, like a letter written not to be sent, but to be read aloud to oneself in a quiet room. Eli leaned back in his chair. The cardigan no longer bore a tear. The house no longer held the same kind of silence, and he, with the weight of a slow stitch and the memory of quiet mending, felt something close to peace. The day opened with a kind of stillness that only mid-autumn could bring. It wasn't the silence of absence, but rather the quiet of things that had settled into their places. Even the wind, which had stirred the trees so gently the evening before, seemed content to rest a while. Eli rose with no sense of urgency. He moved through the morning like someone walking through dew-laced grass, each step slow, measured, with soft reverence for what hadn't yet fully awakened. The kettle took longer to boil, or maybe it just felt that way, with no ticking clock and no waiting appointment, only time, moving at its own familiar pace. He poured hot water over tea leaves, watched the steam drift up toward the window, and felt, as he often did, a kind of companionship in the ordinary. Later, after the tea had cooled slightly, he stepped into the front room. The light was streaming in at an angle, catching on the dust motes in the air, turning them gold for a moment before they disappeared again. In the far corner of the room stood the desk, a simple piece of furniture, crafted decades ago from walnut, solid, unpolished, dependable. Not the kind of desk built to impress, but the kind made to last, to hold papers and pens, recipes and postcards, birthday cards never mailed, and the occasional half-finished list of things to pick up in town. Eli hadn't opened the desk drawers in a long while, not out of sadness, but because the desk had begun to feel like a part of the house itself, quiet, constant, and not needing much. But that morning, something nudged him. Not a sound, not a thought, but a gentle instinct, like a breeze moving through curtains left slightly ajar. He pulled the chair out carefully. It groaned in its joints, reminding him of how long it had gone untouched. He sat down facing the grain of the wood, his hands resting on its surface like a prayer. There, beside the ink blotter, sat the small ceramic jar where Miriam had kept her fountain pens. Most were dried now, but one, her favorite, remained capped, its body smooth and dark green, with a small chip near the nib. He uncapped it gently, as if the act itself might stir her voice back into the room. He didn't write right away. Instead, he opened the drawer on the right. Inside, as if waiting, was a small stack of folded stationery, ivory-colored, with faint blue lines and a single pressed flower tucked between the top sheets, a faded violet. He touched the petals carefully, their texture paper-thin, almost transparent. Miriam had pressed them every spring, slipping them between the pages of her books, or sealing them into envelopes with notes only she ever read. "Violets remember better than we do," she'd once said, smiling as she tucked one into his coat pocket. He had found it 3 months later, dry and sweet-smelling, a message without words. Eli unfolded a sheet of the stationery and began to write. Not a letter this time, not to Miriam, not to anyone. Just a note, a few lines to mark the quietness of the day, to place something small and gentle into the world, as if kindness itself needed to be written down in ink now and then, to be remembered. The trees are holding on, but only just. The gold in the leaves looks tired, but not sad. The bread this morning smelled like home. I lit the lamp early, just because. Nothing happened today. It was perfect. He folded the page, slid it back into the drawer, and closed it without a sound. Later, when he stepped out onto the porch, the clouds had begun to gather. Not storm clouds, just soft gray layers, moving slowly across the sky like thoughts returning home. The candle from the night before still sat on the table. The wick had curled slightly, as if it too had rested well. Eli struck a match and lit the candle anyway, though it was not yet evening. There was no rule that said light had to wait for darkness. Sometimes light simply wanted to be. He sat in his chair, blanket pulled across his knees, hands folded loosely. A few birds hopped across the yard, small brown ones with quick feet and curious eyes. He didn't know their names, but Miriam would have. She would have called them something soft, something just between the two of them. He thought of the desk again, the way the drawers slid open just so, the way her pen had felt in his hand, how certain objects in life stop being objects and become small containers of meaning, not because of what they are, but because of who we were when we touched them last. The candle flickered, the wind leaned in, and the trees rustled their quiet response. A neighbor drove by in the distance. He could hear the faint crunch of gravel, then the hum of tires before it faded again. He didn't wave, didn't need to. Some gestures are understood even when unseen. The light that afternoon lasted longer than expected. It lingered, hung low in the sky as though the sun too wanted to sit a while, watch the porch, listen to the slow creak of the rocking chair. Eli rocked gently. The world moved around him, slowly, softly, in no hurry to be anything more than it was. And he, with pen-stained fingertips and the scent of violet still faint in his hands, felt a kind of grace that needed no name. By the third week of October, the trees at the edge of the field had lost most of their leaves. What remained clung not out of fear, but out of a kind of grace, as if they had one more morning to watch, one more soft wind to hear before they too would drift gently to earth. Eli noticed. He noticed everything more in autumn, not because he tried harder, but because the world moved slower, and so did he. It was on a gray-silver morning, the kind that begins with breath visible in the air and tea cooling too fast in the cup, that he remembered the quilt. Not just a quilt, but the quilt. The one Miriam had started the winter after they were married. He hadn't thought of it in a long while. It hadn't been used in years, not since it was folded and placed gently into the cedar chest at the foot of their bed. But that morning, something in the air, a smell of wool, a flicker of color in a pile of leaves, called it forward in his mind. And so, after washing his hands and finishing his tea, he knelt beside the chest. The hinges creaked in a low, kind way, the sound of old wood stretching into the day. Inside, the scent of cedar rose up, clean and warm, mingled with the faintest trace of lavender soap and something older, like memory pressed into fabric. There it was, folded just as she'd left it, edges aligned, corners squared. Miriam had never folded anything without care. Even dish towels were given a kind of dignity in her hands. The quilt was heavier than he remembered. It had weight, not only from the fabric, but from the stories sewn into it. He carried it to the armchair by the front window, laid it over his lap, and sat. Outside, the sky was pale and waiting. The field shimmered with dew, and a single crow walked the fence line, pausing every few steps as if considering its next sentence. The quilt was made of pieces. Of course it was. Most quilts are. But this one had a kind of rhythm in its patchwork. He could still trace it with his fingers. A square of deep red flannel from his first hunting jacket, a scrap of blue gingham from the apron she wore every summer, and in the lower corner a bit of green corduroy, from a pair of trousers he had outgrown but never really stopped loving. He ran his hand across each one, pausing longer on the little piece of yellow linen that had come from the dress she wore that Easter when they'd sat beneath the plum tree, her head resting on his shoulder, the sunlight catching in her hair just right. That piece had always been his favorite. He pulled the quilt up across his chest and closed his eyes, not to sleep, not yet, but to listen, to the wind tapping softly at the window, to the steady hum of the old refrigerator down the hall, to the deep, settled quiet of the house that had grown with him, aged with him, and held space for all the things unsaid. At some point, he must have dozed off. When he woke, the room was lit by late afternoon. A golden sort of hush poured through the glass, and the quilt still held its warmth. He stretched, slow and careful, then folded the quilt back into its square and returned it to the chest, but not quite the same. This time he left it on top, easier to reach should the cold return tomorrow. And it would. He could feel it, the kind of cold that comes not with bitterness, but with clarity, the kind that brings the scent of chimney smoke and the ache in your hands and the deep gratitude of hot bread in quiet evenings. He lit the porch lamp early that day, not because it was dark, but because the light inside him felt like it needed company. The candle followed, then the rocking chair, then the sound of a single acorn dropping from the oak. He wrapped himself in the cardigan with the mended sleeve and sipped from a mug filled with something warm and familiar. A blend of chamomile and rosemary, steeped longer than the label suggested. He liked it that way. Bitter, earthy, slow. As dusk settled, he watched a squirrel race along the fence, pause atop a post, and flick its tail once before disappearing behind the shed. A small thing, but not insignificant. Nothing that belongs to the rhythm of the day is ever insignificant. He looked down at his hands, resting in his lap, still, folded, the same hands that had mended buttons, held spoons, wiped tears, planted seeds. Now, they simply rested. Before going in, he stood at the edge of the porch, looked out across the fields that were now more gold than green, and whispered, to no one in particular, "It's enough. It's all enough." Then he turned off the candle, left the porch light glowing, and stepped back inside, where the quilt waited in the cedar chest and the house held its breath in the gentlest way. By the time November began to edge into the valley, the evenings arrived noticeably earlier. Not all at once, but gradually, the way an old friend might return. First a letter, then a voice on the phone, and finally, one day, a knock on the door just after sunset. Eli had always liked the coming of early dusk. It changed the shape of time, made hours stretch a little longer, as though the world were politely giving permission to slow down sooner. That afternoon, he stood by the front window, watching the light dim earlier than the day before. The trees along the far end of the fence line, now bare-limbed, looked like graphite sketches against the deepening sky. There was no wind. Even the leaves on the porch steps, so easily stirred in the past weeks, lay still, gathered in lazy curls against the railing. Inside the house, the warmth had settled into corners. The fire, though not roaring, glowed softly in the stove, its embers humming like old lullabies. Eli walked toward the hallway slowly, his slippers making the faintest whisper on the worn rug. He passed the mirror that hadn't been cleaned in months and paused a moment, not to examine himself, but to remember the days when he and Miriam would catch one another's reflections and smile, saying nothing, just a glance, and that was enough. At the end of the hall was the small writing desk, different from the large one in the living room. This was hers, not fancy, pine, with the narrow drawer and a little ceramic knob shaped like a daisy. Eli had replaced it once after the original cracked, choosing the new one from a jar of mismatched pieces at the town's antique store. She'd laughed when he showed it to her. "Too pretty for that old thing," she'd said, but she'd never changed it. The drawer had been left untouched since the spring she passed, not out of grief, but out of reverence. Some things don't call to be reopened until they're ready. But tonight, something was different. The dusk had carried a softness that stirred a need. Not loud, not urgent, just present. He reached for the daisy-shaped knob, pulled gently. The drawer slid open with a sigh, as if it had been holding its breath all this time. Inside were papers, notebooks, envelopes, little folded slips of paper with dates in the corners. At first glance, it looked like clutter, but Eli knew better. Miriam had never kept anything without purpose. He lifted one of the small folded papers, yellowed slightly, with a delicate crease down the middle. Unfolding it slowly, he read, April 17th. Eli baked bread again. The kitchen smelled like 1974. He sang the old hymn while he kneaded the dough, but didn't know I heard him. I hope he always sings when he thinks he's alone. Eli closed his eyes, not to hold back anything, just to let the words rest in the space around him. He picked up another. October 9th. There's a new bird at the feeder. Small, rust-colored belly. Eli named it Oliver. We watched it together this morning and said nothing. The silence was enough. And another. June 2nd. The porch light flickered tonight. He noticed. He always does. He didn't cry. Not exactly. But something shifted in his chest. Not like a break, but like a door quietly opening into a room he thought had been sealed. He gathered a few of the notes, folded them neatly, and placed them into the pocket of his cardigan. Then, without much thought, he lit the lamp in the hallway. Its glow reached only a few feet in either direction, but it felt like enough. He turned off the fire stove, just for a while, and stepped out onto the porch, carrying the candle in its little glass holder and a blanket for his knees. The porch was dim but welcoming. He settled into the rocker. The flame inside the glass danced faintly, casting shadows on the boards and railing, the way it always did this time of evening. He reached into his pocket and drew out one of the notes. He didn't read it again, just held it, felt the texture of the paper between his fingers, as if somehow the act of holding memory was more important than reliving it. From the quiet field beyond the fence, a barn owl called once, then fell silent again. The wind stirred, lifting a single dried leaf and carrying it in a small arc across the porch before it seemed to rest near Eli's slipper. He bent slowly, picked it up and placed it next to the candle. No need to move it farther. Some things are meant to stay close even when they no longer cling to the branch. A light mist had begun to fall. Not rain, but the kind of gentle moisture that softens the air and blurs the lines of things. The candle's flame remained steady. So did Eli. He thought of the drawer, the notes, the years, and he whispered, so softly that even the wind might have missed it, "Thank you for writing me down." The morning that followed arrived without fuss. No sudden light, no sharp chill, just a slow unveiling of a sky the color of faded parchment. Eli sat at the kitchen table with both hands around his mug, not drinking, just holding, letting the warmth soak into his fingers, letting the silence of the house wrap around his shoulders like one of Miriam's old shawls. The candle from the night before had burned down low. Only a shallow pool of wax remained in the dish, cooling into stillness. He didn't light a new one. The day, it seemed, was already lit from within, not with brightness, but with a softness that asked for no more than to be noticed. He washed his face at the old enamel sink, watching the water pool in the basin before draining away. The mirror above it was smudged in the corners, a thin web of age along the edges, like frost on a barn window. He wiped it gently with the sleeve of his shirt, not to make it clearer, but simply as a way of saying hello to the man who looked back at him. The hallway closet, narrow and quiet, held things that hadn't been touched since early summer. Among them was a wooden box, about the size of a bread loaf, with a rusted hinge and a thin crack running across the lid. It was a seed tin, one Miriam had kept for years, not because they planted often. Their garden had long since shrunk to a few herb pots by the porch, but because she believed in keeping seeds just in case. In case what? Eli once asked her. In case hope returns. She'd smiled, her eyes steady, soft with something he couldn't quite name. He brought the tin to the table and opened it. Inside were envelopes, some labeled in her handwriting, others blank and bound with string. There were seeds of every kind: sunflowers, basil, marigold, zinnia, dill, peas. Some so tiny he barely dared breathe over them. He reached for the packet marked lavender, West Side bed. He remembered that bed. It sat beneath the kitchen window, where the sun would strike full around 10 in the morning. She loved tending it in bare feet, her hem brushing the stalks as bees circled lazily around her. He ran his thumb along the edge of the paper envelope, then placed it down, careful as if handling a bird's egg. He found the little notebook tucked beneath the packets. The pages were thin and curled at the edges, ink faded in places but still clear enough to trace her thoughts. March 4th. Sun warmed the porch railings today, lavender sprouting. We sat together with tea. The light made everything seem possible. May 17th. Peas struggling. Too much rain. Eli says it's a good struggle. I think he means life. He's right, of course. July 2nd. The sunflower heads are heavy now. They bow like monks in prayer. I think that's beautiful. He says I always find meaning in everything. Maybe I do. Eli smiled, a small, inward kind of smile that carried a weight all its own. He flipped to the last page, blank, and for a long moment he simply stared at it. It wasn't sad, it wasn't even empty, it was waiting. Outside, the breeze had picked up, not sharp, just steady. The kind that nudged shutters, rustled the dry hydrangea by the porch, and stirred the memory of spring inside autumn's arms. He stepped outside with the seed tin, the notebook, and a small trowel he hadn't used in months. The patch near the porch, where the lavender used to grow, was overrun now with leaves and thyme. He knelt slowly, brushing aside the layers of the season, each movement deliberate, each breath a quiet offering to the earth. He didn't plant much, just a few seeds, not for the bloom, not even for the scent, but for the rhythm, for the gesture of it, the saying, I remember, I am still here, and this small thing still matters. He covered the seeds gently with soil, pressed his palm to the earth, and whispered something into the wind, something without words, more feeling than sentence, a kind of vow. Then he sat back on his heels, watched the sky for a while, clouds shifting like stories passing through an old neighborhood, and returned inside. Later that evening, the porch light came on, same as always, but this time Eli added something. He placed the seed tin, now slightly ajar, on the small table near the rocking chair. Next to it, he set the candle, and beside that, the notebook open to the last page. He didn't write in it, not yet. Some pages are meant to remain unwritten for a time, to hold the quiet weight of what is still becoming. He sat, blanket over his knees, watching the flicker of light against the wood, listening to the wind move through the bare branches above. And in that moment, that small, honest moment, the house, the garden, the season, and all the years behind him felt as though they had gathered close to sit with him once more. Not to say anything, not to fix or explain, just to be there. As the candle burned and the porch light watched and the seeds slept beneath the soil, waiting for spring, the rain returned that night, not in torrents, but in that soft, meandering way that makes you feel like the world is whispering to itself. It tapped gently on the roof, a rhythm older than memory, like the sound of distant conversation in a room you used to know. Eli lay in bed with the quilt pulled up to his chest, its weight a comfort, its warmth more than just temperature. It held something of her still, not just scent or fabric, but presence. He listened to the rain the way one listens to music without lyrics, letting it carry him not forward, but inward. The windows misted at the corners. The candle on the bedside table burned low. He didn't need to read, didn't need to speak. The house itself was a kind of lullaby. Sometime in the early hours, he stirred and rose, not because he couldn't sleep, but because he'd slept long enough for now. The house was dim, washed in that bluish hue that comes before the world remembers how to be morning. He walked slowly through the hallway, bare feet on cool wood, the grain of the floor familiar under every step. Each floorboard had its own voice. Some creaked like old knees, others groaned with the memory of decades of footsteps. It was a language, invisible but intimate. He passed the bookshelf near the window. Its contents had gathered dust, but not neglect. Books, even when untouched, still belong. He reached out and let his finger trail along the spines. Some cracked, some faded, some bearing notes in her hand on the inside flap. He smiled at one in particular, a gardening journal she never quite finished. Tucked inside was a pressed fern leaf, flattened but whole, a quiet echo of something green and growing. He made tea, as he always did, with the same worn kettle and the same chipped mug, the one with the little blue sailboat that had long since lost its mast. He never minded the missing part. In fact, he liked it better that way. Perfection, he had come to believe, was the least interesting thing a thing could be. He sat in the armchair by the window with the quilt draped across his lap and the tea warming both his hands and the space between his ribs. Outside, the sky was beginning to bloom with that delicate gray pink that only happens when a rainy night leans gently into a sleepy morning. On the porch, the light still glowed, soft and steady. It was never turned off anymore, not because he forgot, but because forgetting didn't seem possible. It had become part of the house, part of the rhythm. Birdsong began slowly, a tentative chirp here, a low warble there, as though the world were slowly unzipping itself from slumber. A squirrel scurried along the fence, not hurried, just purposeful. And across the field mist rose in thin tendrils, weaving between fence posts and fading into the woods. He watched, without expectation, without analysis. Just the watching was enough. Later, after he'd rinsed his mug and folded the quilt over the back of the chair, he wandered into the front room. There was a drawer he hadn't opened in some time, the one beneath the radio cabinet. It stuck a little, then gave way with a small exhale of dust and time. Inside were old letters, postcards, a few paper napkins with notes scrawled in pencil, and among them a recipe card, faded ink but unmistakably hers, molasses bread for slow days. He held it like a photograph. There was something so tender in the simplicity of her handwriting. No flourishes, just truth. He baked the bread that afternoon, the kitchen filled with the scent of cloves, brown sugar, and that dark, earthy sweetness that makes a place feel inhabited by kindness. He hummed, not a melody, just a sound of contentment, and when the bread was done, he left it to cool on the rack, as she used to. Later, he cut a slice, spread a bit of butter across it, and ate it slowly on the porch. The candle beside him flickered with the breeze, and the porch light blinked once, just once, as though acknowledging his quiet offering. Evening returned in its usual way, without announcement, without fanfare. The sky folded itself into dusk, and the birds receded into branches. The world settled again. Eli placed the recipe card back into the drawer, tied it with a small string, and whispered to no one in particular, "I remember the way you loved quiet things." Then he sat again in the rocker, the blanket now over his shoulders, the mug warm with his second brew of tea, and he waited, not for anything grand or changing, just for night to continue being night. The floorboards creaked behind him as the house exhaled softly, a living memory in a world still spinning gently beneath its old tin roof. By mid-November, the landscape had shed most of its color. Only the stubborn golden leaves of the sweet gum tree held on, clinging like soft bells in the wind, rustling gently with each passing breath of air. Eli sat on the back steps this time, where the porch dipped into the yard, and the garden, now mostly bare, rested in its brown sleep. He was wearing a flannel shirt that had once belonged to Miriam. It was loose on him, the sleeves rolled up just slightly at the wrist, faded plaid that carried the scent of cedar and old drawer linings. Around his neck was a red wool scarf, frayed at one end, still holding the tiny snag where it had once caught on the fence during a windy afternoon. Miriam had knit it herself back when their bones were younger and their winters felt longer. He didn't wear it for warmth, not really, but there was something about the way it lay across his shoulders, as if a memory had hands and knew just how to rest gently against a person's skin. He looked out across the field where the grass had turned a pale rust color, and the trees stood quiet, as if listening to the earth exhale. It was a still day, the kind that doesn't ask for anything, only invites you to notice. He sipped from a mug of cinnamon tea and let his thoughts settle, not in any orderly way, but the way leaves drift down, unrushed, unworried about where they land. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped. 3 beats, a pause, then 2. Eli smiled. He remembered how Miriam used to tap back, a kind of playful echo that had no meaning other than joy. She said the birds deserved an answer. He believed her. After a while, he stood and walked toward the old storage shed behind the house. Its door groaned in protest as he opened it, revealing a chaos of garden tools, half-used seed bags and jars with lids too tight to open. On the shelf above the broken hoe was an old box marked Winter. Inside, a wreath frame, a spool of twine, a few faded ribbons, and a bundle of dried orange slices strung together with old thread. They used to make simple decorations in late November, not for guests. They rarely had any, but for the house itself. As Miriam would say, you don't need a reason to honor where you live. He carried the box back to the porch and set it on the small table near the rocker. As the afternoon stretched thin, he began tying the wreath, slowly, the way one might tell a story, loop by loop, pause by pause. He added bits of rosemary from the pot beside the steps, some dried lavender, and a ribbon that had once been tied around a birthday pie. His hands moved gently, but with certainty, no rush, no plan, only the motion of care made visible. When it was finished, he didn't hang it, not yet. He left it resting on the table, where the light from the late sun cast a golden sheen across its edge. Then, for no particular reason, he walked to the edge of the field, not far, just to the place where the trees began and the stones from the old wall still jutted from the earth like half-buried thoughts. There, beneath a patch of thin grass, was a bench they'd built together from 2 logs and a wide plank. He sat, feeling the cool wood beneath him, and looked up at the sky. The clouds were long and flat, brushed across the horizon like someone had taken a wide hand and smoothed them gently. No birds, no wind, only the soft hush of time moving unnoticed. He stayed until the sun lowered just enough to send a golden path across the tops of the bare branches. Then he rose, walked slowly back to the house and climbed the steps. He picked up the wreath, still fragrant with rosemary and lavender, and hung it on the inside of the door. He lit a candle beside it, a quiet flame for a quiet offering. Evening came without asking. The light slipped away behind the hills, and the chill crept into the corners of the porch. But the scarf was still warm, and the tea had been brewed again. Eli sat once more in the rocker, watching the candle flicker against the wreath, watching the shadows grow longer along the porch rails. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. Some days don't ask for reflection, only attention, and perhaps a scarf, a wreath, and the hush of a house that remembers how to love quietly. The following morning arrived without ceremony, just the soft lifting of darkness from the corners of the house. There was no rush to greet it. The world outside still felt held in a whisper, fog clinging to the branches, grass damp and cool under the weight of the night. Eli stood by the kitchen window, a patchwork quilt folded over one arm. It was one of Miriam's, stitched together from the scraps of shirts, aprons, old pillowcases, each square a fragment of a life sewn slowly. It smelled of cedar and linen, and of something else, something that couldn't be named but lived somewhere in the folds, a kind of warmth that memory gives without needing to speak. He placed the quilt over the back of the rocker on the porch, then paused. The light was still on, as always, and in the faint gold of morning, the porch carried the hush of a chapel, not the kind built of stone and glass, but one shaped from silence and habit and presence. He sat with his tea, sipping slowly, letting the day stretch around him like a cat in sun. Later, he decided to walk, not far, just to the far end of the property, to where the old fence curled along the woods like the hem of a coat. It was a place they used to visit in early autumn, when the leaves were just turning, when the air was crisp enough to hold the scent of soil and cider in the same breath. He took the long path, the one worn by foot and memory, past the well pump, past the bent lilac bush, and through the small orchard where a few apples still clung to bare limbs, defiant and shriveled, like old farmers refusing to come in from the cold. The trees along the way stood quiet, branches half bare, a few leaves still twisting slowly in the breeze. Each footstep stirred the fallen ones, crunching, whispering, a language of autumn only the body understands. He bent once to pick up a particularly vibrant leaf, red at the tips, gold in the center, veined like a map no longer used. He turned it over in his palm, the stem broken, but the beauty untouched. There was a kind of grace in that. At the fence, he rested his arms across the top rail, looking out into the woods beyond. Sunlight laced through the branches, weaving long shadows across the leaf-covered ground. A squirrel darted between trunks. Somewhere, a crow called once, then went silent. He stayed a while, not thinking, not remembering, just being, letting the stillness settle around him like the quilt he'd left on the rocker. As he turned to walk back, his eyes fell upon a small stone tucked into the base of an old oak. It wasn't large, but it had been placed deliberately, angled slightly as though meant to mark something. He remembered Miriam had once buried a time capsule there, a tin box filled with what she called ordinary treasures. They never planned to dig it up. That wasn't the point. It's not for finding, she had said as she pressed the dirt gently over it, her hands streaked with soil and sunlight. It's for leaving something behind that doesn't need to be remembered in order to matter. He smiled at the thought, then touched the top of the stone, not to uncover, but to honor. Some things are better left buried, not because they're forgotten, but because they've been fully lived. Back at the house, he set another kettle to boil. The scent of the last molasses bread still lingered in the air, sweet and earthy, a flavor that seemed to hum in the floorboards. He poured his tea and stepped onto the porch again. The quilt was still there, and so was the wreath. A soft wind nudged the ribbon gently, as if the air had learned to breathe slower here. He wrapped the quilt around his shoulders, sipped his tea, and let his eyes rest on the candle he'd left unlit beside the door. Not every light needs flame. Some glows come from memory, from habit, from the simple act of presence repeated each day like a blessing too gentle to name. The sun rose higher, spilling across the fields, and Eli closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen, to the porch creaking, to the wind in the grass, to the small hush that filled the space between all things that remained. The first real frost arrived on a Tuesday morning, quiet as a sigh, settling across the field like a hush laid gently over the land. Eli noticed it first in the way the grass held its breath, each blade laced with silver threads, the air still and reverent. There was no wind, no bird song, only the soft creaking of the old porch boards as he stepped out with the steaming mug cupped in his hands. The world looked paused as though someone had whispered, "Hold still," and everything had obeyed. He had known this morning would come. Winter had been moving in slowly, not with urgency, but with intention, a gentle kind of insistence, the way sleep eventually comes to even the most restless mind. But still, something about this particular morning felt heavier, like memory had gathered in the air and was waiting to be named. He sat in the rocker without his usual quilt, allowing the cold to touch his skin, to remind him that time was moving even in stillness. In the kitchen earlier, he had reached for 2 cups instead of 1, a habit left over from years when mornings were made with quiet conversation and the occasional gentle argument about whether to sweeten the tea. She had always insisted yes, he always said no, and yet he'd always sweeten hers, and she'd always sip his unsweetened cup just to tease him. Little acts of loving disagreement, woven into the fabric of the everyday. Now it was just 1 cup, and even so, it felt like too much. He let the steam rise against his face and tried to remember how the mornings had felt before her absence filled them. The porch light still glowed behind him, its golden cast paling in the rising frost light, but it remained. Steady, quiet, a soft echo of her hand reaching for the switch each dusk. Later that morning, he wandered into the back room of the house, the one they never really used except for storing old coats and boxes that smelled of cedar and age. There, tucked behind a stack of knitting baskets, was the winter trunk, painted pine, edges worn smooth by years of being moved but never discarded. Miriam's handwriting still marked the side in faint pencil. First, snow things. He sat beside it, fingers tracing the faded letters. Then, slowly, he opened the lid. Inside were things that made no noise but carried 1,000 echoes. A pair of her old wool mittens, mended at the thumbs with blue thread. A snow globe, the kind with a tiny barn and a horse half lost under the white flakes that never quite settled. A candle in the shape of a pine cone. A single button, ivory, large, from a coat she had loved and worn until the elbows thinned like rice paper, and at the bottom, wrapped in a scarf she had knit during the long evenings of their first winter, was a small notebook. He brought the notebook to the kitchen table. The pages were soft from time, edges curled, ink faded. Inside were notes, but not the kind you'd expect. No journal entries, no reflections, just observations, single-line thoughts, fragments of noticing. Snow fell sideways today. The birds seemed unbothered. Made cornbread, burnt the bottom again. Eli didn't mind. The light in the hallway feels softer in December. He hummed while chopping wood, didn't know I was listening. He read slowly, each line like a lantern in a long hallway, soft, guiding but never demanding attention. She had written the world the way it was, without embellishment, without judgment, and somehow it made the quiet of the house feel less empty, not filled, but accompanied. That evening, he lit the pinecone candle. It gave off a scent of something sweet and earthy, like memory warming its hands by a fire. He sat again on the porch, the notebook in his lap, reading by the light of the porch lantern and the soft flame beside him. He didn't cry. That had passed in earlier seasons. What he felt now was quieter than sorrow, a kind of peaceful ache, like the sound of wind through trees that once held leaves. As night drew in, he closed the notebook, wrapped the scarf tighter around his neck, and watched the frost reclaim the field. The stars began to arrive, one by one, as if they too had been tucked in a trunk and were now being gently brought back into the sky. Eli whispered something, not to be heard, just to be said, then rose, turned off the kitchen light, and left the porch lantern burning. A small fire against the long dark, a reminder that even the quietest winters are still alive with light. It was the kind of morning that came without edges, sky pale as unbleached cotton, clouds drifting low and slow as if the earth were pulling them down gently to rest a while. Eli sat at the table near the back window, where the light fell across the wood like water. On the table, a pad of paper yellowed at the corners, a pen he hadn't used since spring, and a ceramic cup filled with lukewarm tea he'd already forgotten to drink. He had woken early, earlier than usual even for him, not with purpose, but with a tug, like something soft had nudged him from sleep and whispered, "Today." He didn't question it. There were days like that. The pen sat still for a long time, as his hand rested beside it, not ready to begin, but not willing to leave. Outside, a single crow passed overhead, its wings barely brushing the silence. Somewhere behind the barn, a rusted weather vane creaked, not from wind, but from memory. He took a breath, then wrote in his slow, careful script, "My dear girl." He didn't know what he would say, only that he wanted to say something. He wasn't writing to bring her back. He wasn't writing to heal or to let go. He had done those things in his own quiet way over time, like rain smoothing the edges of a stone. This was something else. A letter for no one to read, a voice reaching across time, not to ask or to answer, but simply to be heard. He wrote about the mornings, how they arrived now with the kind of softness he hadn't noticed before. He wrote about the apples in the orchard, how one branch still bore fruit long after the others had given up, how the deer had returned to the field, moving through the tall grass like old friends too polite to knock. He told her the porch light still burned every evening, though no one asked it to, how the kettle still sang the same low song as if remembering who used to lift it. He even mentioned the scarf and the pinecone candle and the note in her handwriting that still lived tucked behind the sugar jar. He paused often, not to think, but to feel, to let the air settle again around him, to let the words unfold on their own terms. There was no rush. That had never been her way, nor his. He remembered once she'd said, "Most things grow better if you leave them alone a little." So he did. He left space between sentences, let silence bloom on the page, and in that stillness, a kind of tenderness gathered, not pain, not even sadness, just the quiet weight of love that had outlived its name. He ended the letter simply. "I missed the way you listened, even when I said nothing. Love, always, E." He folded the paper, not to send it, but to hold it in his hands as one might hold a feather, or a leaf, or a small breath of warmth on a cold day. Then he placed it inside an empty envelope, left it unsealed, and tucked it into the drawer beside her old knitting needles and the spool of blue thread she once used to mend his favorite socks. That afternoon, he sat again on the porch. No book, no task, just the quiet of the hour and the feel of the chair beneath him. The breeze was steady, cool but not harsh, carrying the faint scent of distant chimney smoke and the dry leaves stirring against the steps. He closed his eyes, listening to the small movements of the world. He didn't need to reread the letter. It had already done its work. It had reminded him that love need not be loud to be lasting. That remembrance, offered gently, can be its own kind of prayer. The sun dipped lower, light caught in the kitchen window, throwing shadows long across the floor. The porch lantern flickered softly on. Eli stayed until the sky turned violet, then deeper still. He rose, folded the blanket on his lap, and stepped inside, but he left the porch light burning, just as she would have, just as he always would. The morning had passed in its usual hush, the kind of hush that winter lays down like a shawl over rooftops and fields. Eli had spent the early hours mending a fence post along the south side of the garden, though the garden had long gone to sleep for the season. The post wasn't needed for anything in particular, but something about setting it upright again felt like a small kindness, as if he were tending to something that still mattered, even when no one saw. It was after lunch, when the light outside took on that late-day amber hue, that he heard the faint crunch of feet on the gravel drive. Not hurried, but curious, the kind of steps that stop now and then, not because of doubt, but because of wonder. He turned from the kitchen sink and glanced out the window. There, near the edge of the path, stood a small figure in a red knit hat, holding a paper bag with both hands as if cradling something fragile. He dried his hands, folded the towel neatly, and stepped out onto the porch. The child, maybe 8 or 9, looked up, not startled, but thoughtful, as though taking in the man in the house as part of the same quiet scene. "Hello," Eli said gently. The child nodded. "My mom baked extra ginger cookies. She said you might want some." Eli smiled, a slow, inward smile that carried the weight of many winters. "Well now, that's a kindness I won't refuse." He stepped down slowly, his joints complaining in their own quiet language, and accepted the bag as though it were something more sacred than sweets. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara," she said. "My mom says you used to grow the best tomatoes in the county." Eli chuckled. "She's being generous. I just gave them time and water and they did the rest." Clara looked past him toward the porch. "It's warm there," she observed. He nodded. "Would you like to sit for a while?" She hesitated for a beat, then stepped up beside him, her boots brushing dry leaves as she moved. They sat together without talking. The silence wasn't awkward, it was shared. like a quilt stretched across two laps, warmed not by words, but by presence. Clara pulled off her mittens and tucked them into her coat pocket. Her fingers, small and red at the knuckles, curled around the edge of the rocking chair. "Why do you leave the porch light on?" she asked, not as an accusation, but as the kind of question only children ask, direct and innocent, seeking only to understand. Eli thought for a moment. "It's for remembering," he said. She tilted her head. "Remembering who?" "My wife," he replied quietly. She liked knowing there was always a light waiting. Clara didn't speak for a while. When she did, it was almost a whisper. "My grandpa keeps a picture of my grandma on his table. He says it helps him breathe better." Eli looked at her, then out toward the field. "That sounds about right," he said. They shared a cookie, each slowly, letting the ginger and sugar melt together on their tongues. The light faded a little more. Somewhere down the road, a truck passed, its engine a soft hum against the hush of the hour. "Do you miss her every day?" Clara asked. Eli didn't answer right away. "I miss her in the small ways," he finally said. "In the way morning feels quieter without her footsteps, in how I always reach for 2 mugs even when I know I only need 1. Clara nodded, then reached into her coat and pulled out a folded drawing. It was made with crayons, carefully shaded, a bit of smudging where color had been worked too hard. She handed it to him. "This is you," she said, "and that's the porch light." Eli looked at the drawing. It was simple, but everything was there. The chair, the sloping roof, even the little trail of stars above. "Thank you," he said. "I'll keep this somewhere special." Clara stood, pulling her mittens back on. "I have to go now," she said, "but I'll come again. Mom says you have good stories." Eli smiled. "They're mostly quiet ones," he replied. "That's okay," Clara said. "Quiet stories are my favorite." As she walked down the path, her red hat bobbing between the shadows of the trees, Eli sat holding the drawing in one hand, the cookie bag in the other. He didn't move for a long while, just sat there as the porch light flickered gently on beside him and the first stars began to blink through the branches like old friends returning. He tucked the drawing into the same drawer where her scarf lay, beside the letter, beside the pine cone candle. Then he lit the stove for tea, adding an extra spoon of honey, just as she would have liked. The days had grown shorter now, not sharply, but like a candle slowly burning toward the base, soft light diminishing by degrees until it became more glow than flame. Eli noticed it in the way the shadows leaned longer before supper, how the corners of the room seemed to carry a hush, not of silence, but of memory. December had arrived without ceremony, only a light dusting of snow on the barn roof, and the scent of wood smoke clinging to the sleeves of his coat. On the first Sunday of the month, he walked down the path behind the shed to the grove of young evergreens he and Miriam had planted decades ago. The trees were taller now, slender still, but strong in the way that quiet things often are. He didn't carry an axe. He brought a handsaw wrapped in burlap and tied with twine, because even the taking of a tree deserved a kind gesture. He moved slowly, pausing often, his boots crunching the frost-hardened ground until he found one just the right height. Not too full, not too bare. The kind she would have chosen. Cutting it down wasn't difficult, but he whispered, "Thank you," when it leaned into his arms and let go of the earth. Back in the house, he set it into the old wooden stand she had painted green one winter after the paint on the porch railings had faded. He brushed the needles gently, shook out a few dried pine cones caught in the branches, then let it stand for a while before decorating. As if giving the tree a moment to breathe indoors, the ornaments were stored in a soft blue box beneath the linen chest. He hadn't opened it since the last Christmas they'd shared, and even then they had only used a few. He lifted the lid slowly, not with dread, but with care, the way one opens an old book and lets the first page turn itself. Inside were ribbons, glass bulbs wrapped in tissue, and small things made from hands now grown. A crooked felt star from their nephew, a gingerbread man with a missing leg, and an angel Miriam had stitched from lace and threadbare linen. He placed each piece deliberately, not for symmetry, but for meaning. The angel went near the top, not quite centered, but just where she had always liked it. He didn't use lights this year, just candles, the kind set in small brass clips that he would only light briefly in the evenings, while he watched from the chair with a blanket across his knees. Their glow was soft, a kind of kindness that filled the room without pressing against it. That night, after supper, he lit 3 of the candles on the tree and sat quietly, a cup of tea in his hands, watching the way their flames flickered against the walls. The tree didn't sparkle, it breathed. Its presence wasn't festive, it was reverent, like a guest who had come not to be celebrated but to keep company through the long winter nights. He thought of years past, the way Miriam used to hum while trimming the branches, how she always saved the last ornament for him to place, saying, "The tree listens better when you finish it." He remembered the scent of her cinnamon bread rising from the oven, and the way her laughter had filled the room when the dog knocked over the tree one year and pretended nothing had happened. Those memories came not in sharp edges, but in warm folds, like the quilt she had made with patches from old shirts and tablecloths. They wrapped around him quietly. Outside, snow began to fall, not heavily, just enough to make the world sound farther away. He stood, blew out the candles one by one, and whispered a small goodnight to the room. Then he turned off the main light, leaving the porch lamp on, its soft amber casting an invitation out into the snow-lit dusk. In the hallway, as he passed the mirror, he paused, not to look at himself, but to see the reflection of the tree behind him, its simple shape still outlined in the afterglow of candlelight. He smiled, not wide, but with the kind of contentment that comes from honoring something gently. A quiet tree for a quiet December, in a house where love had once lived out loud and now lived quietly in every corner. The morning light had a hush to it, as though it tiptoed across the kitchen floor rather than arriving all at once. Eli stood near the window, holding a warm mug between both hands, watching the breath of the outside world rise in soft curls from the barn's roof. The snow had fallen again overnight, just enough to soften the edges of everything. Even the wheelbarrow, forgotten by the shed, looked like it had been tucked in under a pale white quilt. Inside, the house held its own kind of stillness, not empty, but full of paused time. The tree in the corner remained just as it had been, its branches lightly bowed as if listening. Eli had not planned to do anything particular that day, but something small in him stirred, not from obligation, but from tenderness. He pulled out the drawer by the writing desk and found a stack of index cards, the kind Miriam had once used for recipes, each with rounded corners and faint blue lines like quiet boundaries. He brought them to the table, along with a black ink pen that had dried once and been coaxed back to life with a few drops of water and patience. He sat in the worn chair by the window, the one with the cushion she had sewn from scraps of curtain fabric, faded now, but still sturdy. One by one, he wrote, not letters, not full sentences, just wishes, short ones, true ones, words meant not for the postman, but for the branches of the tree. Peace where silence has settled too deep, warm hands at the table, memory without ache, laughter that doesn't need to be loud, forgiveness even when no one asks. Each card took time. He didn't rush. He let the words find him, the way snowflakes find the surface of still water. Some cards carried memories. For the neighbor boy who used to bring wildflowers in his backpack. For the song she hummed while folding the linens. For the bird that nested near the porch light and returned 3 springs in a row. Others were simpler, a soft place to rest, a gentle December, light that lingers. He punched tiny holes in the tops of the cards, looped bits of twine through each, and tied them to the branches of the tree, not crowded together, but spaced gently, like stars across a night sky. The tree stood still, accepting each offering without question. The cards shifted slightly in the draft as Eli moved around them, but they never fluttered. They listened. By late afternoon, the light outside had gone golden again, stretching long over the fields and spilling through the porch window like tea poured carefully from a kettle. Eli lit 3 candles around the room, one on the mantel, one by the kitchen sink, and one low on the side table, beside the box of matches and a ceramic bird that had sat there for years. He sat in his chair and looked at the tree. He didn't read the wishes again. They weren't for reviewing. They were for being, just as the tree stood not for display, but for company. Just as the house held not for shelter alone, but for remembering. A soft knock startled him. It was Clara, the girl in the red hat, now without mittens, holding something wrapped in parchment. "My mom made cardamom bread," she said. "She said it goes best with quiet." Eli laughed, a low, kind sound. "She's right." He invited her in, and they sat at the table as dusk folded itself neatly around the house. She noticed the cards on the tree right away. "Did you write them?" she asked. He nodded. "They're not presents," he said, "just thoughts." Clara leaned forward. "I like that better than presents." She read a few silently, then picked up a blank card from the table and asked if she could add one. He handed her the pen. She wrote slowly, then smiled. Eli read it after she tied it to a branch low enough for her to reach. Hope for people who think they forgot how. They sat a while longer, not eating much, but sharing a kind of fullness rare and wide. When she left, he walked her to the edge of the path, watched her red hat vanish behind the hedge, and then turned back toward the porch. The light had already come on, soft as ever. Inside, the tree waited, now bearing not just ornaments, but offerings. He sat once more, his heart quiet, and let the hush of the evening carry him like a small boat into the gentlest part of winter. And so, as the porch light glows gently through the falling snow, and the tree stands quietly with its paper wishes swaying ever so slightly, we let this evening close, not with an ending, but with a softness, like a blanket being pulled just beneath the chin. May your breath grow slower and your thoughts drift kindly toward the safer corners of your memory, where warmth still lingers and nothing is asked of you. Good night, dear heart. You've carried enough for one day. Let the night hold you now. If this story brought you a little peace, I'd love to know. And if there's a place your heart longs to return to, a memory, a season, a quiet town, what kind of story would you like me to tell next? Let me know in the comments only if and when you feel ready. I'll be here with another quiet tale whenever you need it.